Hey everybody, Johnny the Queer POTUS here, and today we are going to be talking about secession, specifically the American secession crisis of 1860 to 1861. What were the causes of secession? How did two presidents, James Buchanan and Abraham Lincoln, respond to secession? Was it legal for the South to secede from the Union? Would it be legal for a state to secede from the Union today? And could there be another secession crisis in our modern era? Secession.
I actually think that we're trending toward secession. I see more and more people asking, what in the world do we have in common with the people who live in, say, New York? What is there that makes us believe that there is enough of us there to even have a chance at winning New York, especially if you're talking about votes? I see a lot of bloggers, I can't think of names right now, a lot of bloggers have written extensively about how distant and separated and how much more separated our culture is becoming politically, and that it can't go on this way. There cannot be a peaceful coexistence of two completely different theories of life, theories of government, theories of how we manage our affairs.
But what's interesting about Rush Limbaugh's commentary there is that it's utterly indistinguishable from what the original secessionists said. So this is a declaration of the causes of secession from the state of Mississippi. Every state had a declaration like this. Obviously, there's going to be one big difference between what Rush Limbaugh's saying and what these say, and that it's going to be defending slavery. But other than the fact that it's defending slavery, it's pretty close. The Declaration of Secession complains about how the press has been enlisted in the cause of the abolitionists, how the schools are being pitted against the South. It's going to essentially say that a rogue government has invaded the freedom of the South. And one of the reasons why the South is going to secede is that it feels, after the election of 1860, that it no longer has the power to have influence in the government. It says, we must either submit to degradation and to the loss of property worth $4 billion of money, or we must secede from the Union framed by our fathers. And in the Texas Declaration of Secession, after a long list of grievances, it says, and finally, by the combined sectional vote of the 17 non-slaveholding states, they have elected as president and vice president of the whole Confederacy 2 men whose chief claims to such high positions are their approval of these long-continued wrongs against the South, and their pledges to continue them to the final consummation of these schemes for the ruin of the slaveholding states. It talks about lawlessness in the South. It complains about John Brown and how the northern states see no problem with what John Brown did. It complains about the murder of Southerners by anti-slavery men and how the North is looking the other way. So it's this sense of disenfranchisement that is really fueling the urgency of secession. They have always been pro-slavery. They were pro-slavery in 1854 and 1855, but they secede in 1860 in particular because this election of President Lincoln is the last straw. One thing that didn't happen, the South did not secede all at once. It actually took quite a long time for the secession to complete itself. You can see here a list of the different states that seceded. South Carolina, December 20th, 1860, followed by Mississippi on January 9th, 1861, followed by Florida. You can see there's like a clutch of states that leaves in January and early February. Texas, then there's a big lull. Lincoln gets inaugurated in between that lull. And after Lincoln takes office, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee on June 8th. They left really late. The secession crisis brought up a really interesting question in American history, which is what exactly holds the American Union together? Is it our shared values? Is it our love of democracy and the Constitution? Is it mutual benefit? Is it the economic relations that we enjoy and the prosperity we enjoy as a larger country? Is it just pure rule of law? Is it just people are obeying the law? Or are we kept together by brute force? Is it just the fact that if you tried to secede, there would be consequences? Most Americans believed that brutal force should not be the thing that keeps our union together. Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune said, "We hope never to live in a republic whereof one section is pinned to the residue by bayonets." James Madison at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 said, "The use of force against a state would look more like a declaration of war than an infliction of punishment." Was secession legal? Does a state have the right on its own volition to leave? Is the United States Constitution a voluntary contract? Is the United States a voluntary union? Well, as it stood, the secessionists had a few interesting arguments in favor of the legality of secession. The biggest argument in favor was that the colonies seceded from Great Britain in 1776. Of course, what was it that made their secession legal? The fact that they won a 7-year war against Great Britain. The South did not win the war against the Union, and so this parallel doesn't quite work. But at the time of secession, it made a lot of sense for them to argue that. Kentucky had seceded from Virginia in the late 1700s. Virginia used to be much bigger, but Kentucky had seceded, broken off, and formed its own state. There was a secession movement in New England during the War of 1812, the Hartford Convention, where representatives from New England states actually got together and said, "This War of 1812 is a disaster. James Madison is an idiot. Let's rejoin with Great Britain. They're much smarter." There was a nullification crisis in 1834 that nearly turned into an open revolt. Some of the states in the South were incensed by a tariff and wanted the right to nullify federal laws. Ultimately, they were denied that right. And of course, how did Texas come into the Union? It seceded from Mexico originally. So there were a lot of examples of legal secession that the South could look at as an example of why they were justified in what they did. The offending event which triggers the secession is the election of Abraham Lincoln. The 1860 election was a 4-way race that broke down completely on sectional lines. You can see right here, Lincoln wins the North, Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, wins the South, and Bell, the border state candidate, wins the border states. So every section of the country, except the northern section, were unhappy at the results. And as you can see on this map, the South is quite large compared to the North. But the North has a much larger population and much more representation in the Electoral College. Look, New York, 35 votes, right? Pennsylvania, 27. Texas, 4. Almost immediately after the announcement that Lincoln had won the election, the newspapers were already wondering if the South would secede, although it was looked at with much cynicism. The Southern press continues to discuss the question of secession, pro and con. It will, in the end, amount to nothing but talk if no aggressions are made on the rights of the South. You can see a cartoon of the time, the Republican Party going to the White House, and that is the lunatic asylum. Lincoln is being carried into the lunatic asylum and followed by all of his supporters. There is a particularly racist caricature of a black man walking behind him, looking very civilized. And of course, that is something you'll see in all the declarations of secession, is a sense that Lincoln is going to give up the white man's government by allowing black people to be a part of the society. The Texas articles say that, Mississippi's articles say that, they all say that this government is for the white race. So at the time that Abraham Lincoln is elected, the president of the United States is James Buchanan, and he is going to be the first of these two presidents to have to react to the secession crisis. A little bit of information about Buchanan. He's a lifetime politician, a member of the Democratic Party. He had run for president on keeping the balance of power between the slave states and the free states. He was very much unable to do so, and when he took office, things just continued to deteriorate and slide out of control. And after the election of Abraham Lincoln, he had 4 months to basically decide what he wanted to do about what was going on in the South. And so we're going to take a look at 2 different speeches today. One from James Buchanan, delivered on December 5th, in which he comments on the secession crisis and what the government should do about it, and Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address. And we'll compare the 2 different approaches that these presidents had and what their results were. The first thing you need to know about James Buchanan's response to Southern secession is that he blamed the North. The long continued and intemperate interference of the Northern people with the question of slavery in the Southern states has at length produced its natural effects. The different sections of the Union are now arrayed against each other, and the time has arrived, so much dreaded by the father of his country, when hostile geographic parties have been formed. It's a reference to George Washington's farewell speech in which he warned against sectionalism and geographic parties. Buchanan goes on to complain about the incessant and violent agitation of the slavery question throughout the North for the last quarter of a century. He complains about the preponderance of servile erections. He complains about the preponderance of servile insurrections. In other words, the abolitionists have stirred up the black populations of the South, and now they're engaging in insurrections against their masters. He even invokes the image of a woman being raped, I suppose, by a escaping slave. Many a matron throughout the South retires at night in dread of what may befall herself and children before the morning. And he laments how easy it would be to solve all of this. All that is necessary to accomplish this object is for the South to be let alone and permitted to engage in her domestic institutions. He says the people of the North are no more responsible and have no more right to interfere with slavery than with similar institutions in Russia or Brazil. So basically, in Buchanan's conception, the states have every right to their domestic institutions. And you can see that many people in the North actually agreed with President Buchanan. In Rochester, New York, on January 11th, there was a demonstration against slavery. It featured Susan B. Anthony, among many others. The meeting was broken up by its citizens, and resolutions in favor of the Union were passed. A flag bearing the inscription, "No compromise with slavery," was not allowed to be suspended across Buffalo Street. The authorities prevented a general riot. Lincoln, too, is attempting to comfort the South, although he's going to do it in a much different way. He is not going to lean as heavily into the grievances of the South as President Buchanan has. He says, apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the ascension of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Lincoln even expresses a willingness to sign into the Constitution an amendment which will guarantee the right of each state to order and control its own domestic institutions according to its own judgment exclusively. So at the outset, it seems like both presidents are aligned on this issue, but their views are going to start to diverge, and you'll see how. The Fugitive Slave Act is one of the big issues here, the act by which states were required to return slaves. So if a slave had escaped Kentucky and went into the free state of Indiana, Indiana was expected to enforce the fugitive slave law and return the slave back to Kentucky. And of course, this was one of the big reasons there was a civil war, is because the northern states, the free states, were so incensed by this law, and they saw it as an attack on their freedom. Buchanan, the southern states, standing on the basis of Constitution, have right to demand this act of justice from the states of the North. Lincoln will also express this view. He'll say, if the Senate passed it, if the court didn't throw it out, then it's part of the law, and I as president have a responsibility to enforce the law. But, he says, ought not all safeguards of liberty known in civilized and humane jurisprudence be introduced so that a free man may not in any case be surrendered as a slave? And that's something that Buchanan's not going to bring up. He's going to say, what about people who accidentally get arrested, mistakenly believed to be a fugitive slave, which was something that happened from time to time. So Lincoln is already kind of putting a little bit of doubt on this Fugitive Slave Act. Now, on to the question of whether the states have the right to secede. And this is Buchanan here on his December 5th message to Congress. In order to justify secession as a constitutional remedy, it must be on the principle that the federal government is a mere voluntary association of states to be dissolved at pleasure by any one of the contracting parties. If this be so, the Confederacy is a rope of sand to be penetrated and dissolved by the first adverse wave of public opinion in any of the states. By this process, a union might be entirely broken into fragments in a few weeks, which cost our forefathers many years of toil, privation, and blood to establish. So Buchanan, despite the fact that people say he just let the South leave, he is saying here that he believes secession is ridiculous. The idea of it is just anarchy, right? The Confederacy itself is going to be subject to secession. If it secedes, its states are going to be breaking off left and right, and the whole entire union, which the forefathers toiled to create, is just going to be destroyed by this. So it's not really a matter of secession for President Buchanan. It's a matter of the Union being destroyed itself. Buchanan also makes the argument that it is frankly absurd that the framers of the Constitution would implant in the bosom of this Constitution the seeds of its own destruction. Has the Constitution delegated to Congress the power to coerce a state into submission? No such power has been delegated to Congress or to any other department of the federal government. And again, he quotes Madison from before. We said the use of force against a state would look more like a declaration of war than an infliction of punishment, and would probably be considered by the party attacked as a dissolution of all previous compacts by which it might be bound. Buchanan here is saying, I disagree with secession. However, I cannot use violence to prevent secession, or else I am actually dissolving the Union by attacking the South. So this puts him in a bind. If he lets the South go, he's allowing the Union to be dissolved, essentially. If he attacks the South to prevent them from leaving, he is also dissolving the Union, because he is proving that the Union only exists by military force. And if the Union only exists by military force, it's no kind of Union at all. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Either way, the Union will be destroyed. Lincoln wholeheartedly agrees with Buchanan on the subject of secession being an absurdity. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments, right? No government sets itself up as a temporary government. It is expected to perpetuate, to continue. If the United States be not a government proper, but an association of states in the nature of contract merely, can it, as a contract, be peaceably unmade by less than all the parties who made it? In other words, can one party, say South Carolina, secede without permission from the other parties who signed the Constitution? Remember, the Constitution had to be ratified by all the states. And so every state in 1787 all agreed together to form this union. And it wasn't going to be formed unless they all agreed. And so therefore, any state that agreed on the basis that the other states agreed. And so if one of those states says, you know what, psych, we're leaving, that is breaking the contract. And so that is not a legal action to Abraham Lincoln. He says, no state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union. That resolves, and ordinances to that effect are legally void, and that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary according to the circumstances. There need be no bloodshed or violence, and there shall be none unless it be forced upon the national authority. The power confided to me will be to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, and to collect the duties and imposts. But beyond what there may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere. So Lincoln also agrees, I cannot just go in there and use force against this. However, he says, I am going to carry on as though nothing has happened, and if I should so happen to be attacked by anyone, that will be viewed as an insurrection. Lincoln says, I therefore consider that in view of the Constitution and the laws, the Union is unbroken, and to the extent of my ability, I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the states. So he's saying, I'm just going to be the president of all the states as if nothing happened. I do not recognize the secession. And if anybody tries to do any violence against the national authority in any of the states, well, I'll just consider it a revolutionary action and I will suppress it. Buchanan, on the other hand, is going to take a much more conservative approach. He says the nature of the presidency is to be a conservative. Your job is to administer the laws and to take care of the Constitution, to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And from this obligation, he cannot be absolved by any human power. But what if the performance of this duty, in whole or in part, has been rendered impracticable by events over which he could have exercised no control? Such, at the present moment, is the case throughout the state of South Carolina, so far as the laws of the United States to secure the administration of justice by means of the federal judiciary are concerned. The bare enumeration of these provisions proves how inadequate they are without further legislation to overcome a united opposition in a single state. And so Buchanan basically says, my hands are tied. If a bunch of people in South Carolina get together, they have a convention and they secede, there's absolutely nothing constitutionally that the president can do about it. And this is going to be the big place where Buchanan and Lincoln are going to split, because Lincoln is going to believe basically that the president, of course, has to do something to prevent secession from happening. But at the same time, he does agree with Buchanan's damned if you do, damned if you don't assessment. If he just goes into the South and starts attacking, that action in itself is an abdication of power. It is going to destroy the Union. So what Lincoln is going to end up doing is he is going to carry on as though no secession has happened. And if and when the Southerners attack the U.S. Army, the federal authority in any way, that's going to be his signal that, okay, now as president of the United States, I am going to do whatever I can to suppress the insurrection. At the end of his speech, Lincoln says, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." So Lincoln is setting up the situation in a way that if there is a civil war in the country's future, it will be the South's fault. This quote right here comes from another speech that Lincoln gave, and it's a lot more straightforward in explaining what Lincoln's position here is on secession. Lincoln says, "We have just carried an election on principles fairly stated to the people. Now we are told in advance the government shall be broken up, unless we surrender to those we have beaten before we take the offices. In this, they are either attempting to play upon us, or they are in dead earnest. Either way, if we surrender, it is the end of us and of the government. They will repeat the experiment on us ad libitum. A year will not pass till we shall have to take Cuba as a condition upon which they will stay in the Union." And so you can see that Lincoln does not see secession as states voluntarily leaving a union under which they are oppressed, right? Lincoln sees secession as a conspiracy to subvert a democratic election, to subvert the will of the people, and for the slaveholding power to use what the whole United States has built, to take it, appropriate it to themselves, and use it for their own nefarious aims. Lincoln is even saying that if the South is able to secede, that they're going to spread, right? He says we're going to have to take Cuba, because if we don't, the Confederates are going to go down there and they're going to have slavery in Cuba. They might go into parts of Mexico. Who knows what they're going to do? They're going to go out west. Lincoln is basically looking at secession not as some sort of legal movement, but as the essence of anarchy. So what were the results of Buchanan's speech? Well, there were a few things that happened after Buchanan gave that speech. Number one, on December 20th, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. So the South was not very happy with Buchanan's speech. Days after South Carolina seceded, a delegation from South Carolina actually came to Washington, D.C. as a foreign delegation to open up a trade agreement with the United States government. And Buchanan was prepared to see them. But at the last minute, one of the few sort of pro-union people in his cabinet actually stopped the meeting from taking place. If you look at Buchanan's cabinet here, you notice that there is a preponderance of men who joined the cabinet in 1860 or 1861, and even some who joined in 1860 but were gone by 1861. There were a lot of people on Buchanan's cabinet who came from the South, and when Buchanan showed himself to be ambivalent on whether the South could secede or not, the Southerners on the cabinet did whatever they could to ensure that the South was in an advantageous position by the time Lincoln came into power. In fact, one of his secretaries, John B. Floyd, was actually funneling American money and weapons to the South during this time period. So you had essentially traitors inside of the cabinet. As a result of Buchanan's inaction during this period, he will go down in history as the worst president of all time. And you can see several different rankings here, with Buchanan being either the second worst or the worst. And what did Lincoln's position that the South had never seceded and that any actions against the national authority would be considered insurrectionary? Well, one of the president's duties is to supply the various military forts that we have around the country. And so when Lincoln sends a supply ship into one of those forts called Fort Sumter, Jefferson Davis orders the bombardment of Fort Sumter, and that basically kicks off the war. It's kind of brilliant. Lincoln does not just go in and attack the South just on the mere fact that they declared themselves seceded. And so he is technically not holding the country down by bayonet. Instead, he waits for Jefferson Davis to attack a federal fort, and then he says, they have attacked the United States, and so we must put down the rebellion. Remember how Buchanan said, damned if you do, damned if you don't? Lincoln was able to find a third way, right? Let them attack us, and then it's on. Once the attack took place, Lincoln started to raise an army, which caused a few more states to leave the Union. Virginia was the next state to leave the Union, followed by Arkansas, North Carolina, and finally Tennessee. Lincoln orders the largest military mobilization in history. Congress, which was out of session at the time, later supported his action. So he, like, by dictate, raised an army of, I think, 70,000, and Congress said that was fine in retrospect. Lincoln blockaded the South, which caused him a lot of interesting problems because he's not recognizing secession. Remember, all these states are still part of the Union. As far as Lincoln is concerned, the secessionists have kidnapped the states from the Union, and all the people who live there are being kidnapped, and Lincoln as president is going to protect them from this rebellion. Well, when Lincoln blockades the South, it's an implicit recognition that the South is a legitimate belligerent. Blockades are used against your enemy in a war. If you have a war between France and England, England's going to blockade France as an enemy belligerent. That is considered part of the rules of war. England would never blockade itself. And so when Lincoln blockades the South, he's essentially blockading his own country. He's blockading himself, right? And so the only way this works legally and logically is if Lincoln has recognized legitimacy of the Southern government. There's going to be a lot of vagaries around this, right? Prisoner exchange. How can the Lincoln government enter into negotiations with Jefferson Davis's government over the exchange of prisoners if Lincoln does not recognize legitimacy of the Jefferson Davis government? Lincoln is going to suspend many civil liberties during his administration, including the writ of habeas corpus, and he's going to tangle with the Supreme Court over that one. The Constitution does not give the President of the United States the right to suspend habeas corpus. But once again, Lincoln, citing the wartime emergency, is going to take unprecedented actions. Congress gives Lincoln the power to take all enemy property, setting the stage for the emancipation. So Lincoln is going to have the power to take all enemy property in war, which is not always very typical. And he's going to extend the definition of property to enslaved people. And so the first people to escape slavery during the early years of the Civil War will actually be known as contraband of war, enemy contraband, rather than emancipated humans. It's not until Lincoln actually signs the Emancipation Proclamation that the federal government is recognizing the emancipation of certain enslaved peoples. And at the very end, when all is said and done, the Union wins the war. Lincoln amends the Constitution to mostly ban slavery, except as punishment of a crime, and secession fails. It's kind of interesting. I want to go on this little tangent here. I know not everybody in my audience is a big fan of Jordan Peterson, but one of his maxims, I think, really applies here to President Lincoln. Peterson says that if you want to break a rule, you should first have a full understanding of how it works. Lincoln does engage in many unprecedented actions, which people will denounce as anti-constitutional. But as a lawyer and a scholar of the Constitution, Lincoln had the whole thing pretty much memorized. He would extemporaneously talk about the Constitution. He was part of these lyceums, these debate clubs, basically, where they would constantly talk about constitutionality. He grows up in an age when there's really kind of a cult around this document. People worship the Constitution as this sort of perfect, unbreakable document. Well, it turned out that the Constitution did not have what it took to see the country through a secession crisis. And so at that point, a lot of leaders would have probably walked in and said either, well, In that case, what can I do? Let the South go. That's what Buchanan said. Other leaders might say, well, if the Constitution can't do it, let's just tear it up and burn it. Lincoln, as always, finds a third way. He basically wants to go above and beyond what the Constitution has to offer in order to preserve the Union, because Lincoln says without the Union, there can be no Constitution. So if the Constitution is under threat from being destroyed by secession, it is incumbent upon him as the commander-in-chief, sworn to preserve and protect said Constitution, to take extraordinary measures in pursuit of that goal. So Lincoln is really an example of somebody who understands the Constitution, works within the Constitution, fights to protect the Constitution, but knows how to break the rules when necessary. But in other cases, he's also going to overrule people who try to go too far outside of the confines of the Constitution. John C. Fremont, for example, confiscating slaveholders' lands and attempting to redistribute them through a military decree. Lincoln will suspend that order and say that only the President of the United States, supported by the Congress, can have the right to break the Fifth Amendment, basically. And as a result, by contrast with Mr. Buchanan, President Lincoln will go down in history as the greatest president of all time. Monuments will be built to him, songs will be sung, whole libraries full of books about Lincoln, and he will become one of the most famous Americans in history. So, in conclusion, if there is any question that has been definitively settled in the United States, it is the illegality of secession. This union is not a voluntary union. But at the same time, it is not mere brute force that holds the Union together. After all, Lincoln did not just go in and attack the South. The South attacked Union forts, and then Lincoln went in to suppress a rebellion within the United States. Recently, there has been talk of Texas seceding from the Union. That bill is going nowhere. See some quotes here. Eric McDaniel from the University of Texas at Austin said, "The legality of seceding is problematic. The Civil War played a very big role in establishing the power of the federal government and cementing that the federal government has the final say in these issues." Antonin Scalia, Justice Supreme Court. The answer is clear. If there was any constitutional issue resolved by the Civil War, it is that there is no right to secede. A state can only secede if all parties to the agreement, aka the Constitution, agree to let it secede, or, barring that, the seceding state or states wins a war against the national authority. So only if a section of the country secedes and then wins a war against the national authority will it have legally seceded. So in a sense, it does ultimately come down to the might makes right, the law of power, which determines whether or not secession is legal. It was legal in 1776 because the Patriots won the Revolutionary War. It was illegal in 1860 because the Confederacy did not win the war. However, it is important to note that although Lincoln took many unprecedented steps, and although it took a 4-year war to defeat the Confederacy, Lincoln still remained true to the Constitution. He did not throw out the Constitution. He kept the Constitution by using a mechanism that the founders had put into the Constitution, the amendment mechanism. Lincoln was the first president in 60 years to bring an amendment into the Constitution, number 13. It's important to note that since that moment, many more amendments have been added to the Constitution. And so Lincoln does kind of open a Pandora's box, but that is a subject for another video. So thanks everybody for tuning in today. I hope you learned a lot about secession. If you have any questions or comments, please put them below. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. If you want to become a patron, go to patreon.com/queerpotus. Thanks so much, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day. So, in answer to the question, do I think that secession is possible or even imminent? I do not think that it is imminent, but I do think that it is possible. I think that there would have to be a significant financial interest tied up in the party that seceded. I don't think cultural aggrievement alone, or even a sense of electoral disenfranchisement, as Rush Limbaugh says, is enough to cause a section of the country to attempt to break off from the larger union. I don't really know what financial interest is even sectional anymore. So I don't even know what one section of the country might have a shared and unique financial interest that another section of the country might be threatening with, like excessive regulation or threatening to ban it. The possibility of a north-south split was envisioned by the founders. People throughout the antebellum period of the United States knew that it was possible for secession because it was specifically that it would be along the north-south line. They knew the sections of the country, they knew the issue that was at stake and the financial interest tied to it, slavery. And they were aware that at some point that specific kind of a secession could happen. But I challenge anyone to come up with a section of the country that could plausibly secede. If you think you have one, go ahead and write in the comments, or if you have some other scenario whereby you think secession would be possible, write it down